Hello everybody, my name is Trisha Dean. I'm the Project Manager of the MacGillycuddy Reeks European Innovation Partnership Project. It's a locally led agri-environmental scheme, and I'm joined here by Enda Mullins. Enda works for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. She's based in County Wicklow, so a good journey away from Kerry. But I heard Enda speaking years ago to some farmers, and Enda spoke very well, and we had a great discussion after the talk actually as well with the farmers. Enda's going to talk to us today about Bracken and Gorse management. So Enda's lived and worked in Wicklow for a long time. So we'll have to find out, you'll have to meet Enda on the ground someday in Wicklow to find out more about Enda. So what I will do, guys, is I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what the MacGillycuddy Reeks project is actually about, and then we will go to Enda's presentation. Okay, so hopefully everything will play ball with us today. We love our technology, the Zooms. I think everyone is zoomed out. So as I mentioned, I work as the project manager, the MacGillycuddy Reeks EIP project. I work for South Kerry Development Partnership. So it's a locally led company, non-for-profit organisations working with communities. So what we've been doing here for the last number of years, and up until in April next year, when we're due to finish, we've been developing innovative actions for high nature value farming in the MacGillycuddy Reeks. So a lot of people will be familiar with MacGillycuddy Reeks, obviously, because of Corán Thuaidh, Ireland's highest mountain. So there's our project logo. So we try to really show what we're all about, and that is caring for the mountains in conjunction with the farmers. And that's very important. So that gives everybody there an idea of the area where we work. So some people love maps and more people love photographs. So I've tried to include a little bit of both. That gives you an idea of the terrain we're looking at and the scale of the area. So obviously we're not covering the entire area because we have a limited time and limited budget. So it's only myself working full-time, a part-time project ecologist and part-time administrator, Mary and Mariana. So we're only the equivalent of 2 full-time staff on the project. But we're very fortunate, great little team, getting great work. We're hugely supported by our operational group. Okay, so obviously the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine are the funders for this locally led agri-environmental project, and it's funded through the Rural Development Programme. Like I mentioned, South Kerry Development Partnership, the MacGillycuddy Reeks Mountain Access Forum, Local Farm Advisor, the Local Authority, Kerry County Council, Tralee, Munster, well, it was Tralee IT, it's now the Munster Technological University, have also joined with us, and NPWS are also on our operational group, and Tagish. Okay, so I know a lot of people have probably got to the top, and it's probably a lot of other people's bucket list. So obviously recreation is a huge challenge to be managing as well in the MacGillycuddy Reeks outside of agriculture and very sensitive habitats. So for anyone that doesn't know, what are EIP projects? Well, I've mentioned all this already. It's funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and it's part of Ireland's Rural Development Programme 2014 to 2020. And it's locally led. So there's a number of these around the country. Some of these are coming to a finish shortly. We're due to finish ourselves in April 2022. We're hoping, of course, that we will go beyond that, because for improvements, especially for ecological improvements, it does take time. And to be managing things like Bracken and Gorse that Enda's going to talk to us about, they also take time. And in many cases, it's a multi-annual approach. So there's a number of EIPs around the country dealing with different things. And there's a number of upland EIPs as well. So I would talk to the guys very often there in the SUSE project in Wicklow itself, the Sustainable Uplands Agri-Environmental Scheme, the SUSE, the North Connemara project, there's the Inishowen project in Donegal, so there's a number of them, the Blackstairs project, Farming Futures. So they're some of the upland EIP projects that are operational. So we have similar challenges and we might have slightly different approaches. Okay. So the background to our project, well, what were we set up to do? Well, we were looking to try and improve the sustainability and the economic viability of farming in MacGillycuddy Reeks. So that's not an easy task. We love to give ourselves a challenge, but it is about developing practical, achievable actions and innovative solutions. Okay, so it's all about trying to work with the farmers to find out what works for the farmers, what are the issues on the ground, and how can we really make them better. We were also really tasked with trying to improve the condition of the Natura 2000 area. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But it's about protecting the biodiversity and trying to improve the biodiversity on these private individual farms and commonage lands in the MacGillycuddy Reeks. Okay. So, well, what are the concerns on the ground? Well, habitat, soils and landscapes of conservation value and some of the farming practices in the Reeks, they're under threat. And that's because we're looking at an aging farmer population, smaller farming size, farming, upland sheep farming is particularly challenging. Anybody who works in an upland area will tell you that unenclosed cottages trying to go up to gather sheep to bring them down a couple of times every year is no joke. And the type of sheep as well that are on the mountain, they're not always the most profitable. We have another workshop coming up on that as well. The recreational pressures, obviously I mentioned there's a lot of people bring their dogs. They don't realise the dogs aren't permitted on the land. So that's a big issue, as well as erosion and damage to the habitats from the huge numbers of recreational users. So that's what we're trying to deal with. So it is part, all of MacGillycuddy Reeks is part of the Special Area Conservation. So the whole formal title it's called the Clarny National Park, MacGillycuddy Reeks and the Cara Catchment Special Area Conservation. So that means that all of the lands in this area there are protected under European law for the habitats and the species contained within them. And there's a number of those. Okay, so a lot of people don't realise that when they're actually on the land, that these are protected areas. So I will put up my information again at the end, but this is just at the start. If anybody has any queries, I'm contactable 95% of the time. And it is important if people have queries or questions to contact us. Like, this is what our project is all about as well. It's information and outreach and dissemination. So we have a website we can be contacted on, Facebook, obviously, email, or the old traditional phone call. So that's enough for me. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand back to Enda now, who will hopefully be able to share her screen. So Enda, I might need to give you permission.
Yeah, that's grand.
Now, so hopefully this will work.
That's great. So I will just share my screen and let's see how we get going on this now. Yeah, so excellent. You can see that, can you? That's great. Okay. So thank you very much, Tricia, for the chance to talk today. I wish I was in Kerry talking to you live. I had many happy holidays in Kerry over the years, but also working with the National Parks and Wildlife Service. I've been to Kerry for work quite a number of times as well. And again, full of happy memories of being there. So I'm looking forward to the day that I can in person. So as Tricia said, I'm Enda Mullins. I'm a divisional ecologist with the Parks and Wildlife Service. And I'm also very involved in the SUES project that Tricia mentioned here in Wicklow, which is about sustainable upland vegetation and managing that in a sustainable way. So one of the issues, obviously, for upland management is bracken. And we've plenty of it in Wicklow. So I feel I can talk to you from my experience of bracken here, including in my garden. So that's what I'm going to look at the moment is bracken. But I'm going to be talking to you, I suppose, as an ecologist, not a farmer. And I just want to make that a little bit clear in the beginning, because I'll probably have a different slant on things than you might have coming to this as farmers. But that's good, because the more we learn about things from different angles, the better we will be able to manage it.
Excellent.
So let's see, will the page move for me now? Great, okay. So this is just a little bit of a background then to bracken. And bracken is absolutely everywhere on the planet except in Antarctica. So that's something that we need to kind of remember. But climate change is actually allowing it to spread further. Hopefully it won't get to Antarctica, but it is spreading because of climate change, mostly due to the longer frost-free periods that we have, because frost is a big enemy of bracken. And it is actually the world's most successful fern. So it's able to live in broad sunlight, unlike other ferns. So if you think of, if you had ferns in a garden, or you're going to put them in a shady place, we associate ferns with being in woodlands, but bracken is actually able to take full sun, but it still is a forest plant. So if bracken was in its natural habitat, it would be in sunlit glades within woodlands, so places where trees have fallen and the sun can reach the forest floor. It's a bit fussy about its soils as well. So it does best in deep, fertile soils that are well drained and maybe slightly acidic. And waterlogging causes problems for bracken because it's not able to transport oxygen from the leaves down to the roots in waterlogged conditions. And if you think of where you see bracken, look at the top picture there, you see it on the slopes of the hills where they're well drained. You don't really find bracken down in the bottom of a valley where it's wetter. We know that it causes lots of issues for people, for grazers and for walkers, because they can be very dense stands of bracken and they're difficult to get through. We know ticks live there, and we're all kind of nervous of the diseases that ticks bring. And it can cause big problems on important conservation sites as well, if it replaces, you know, the valuable habitats that we're trying to protect, because it'll shade them out or causes congestion. But in the past, bracken was controlled because people had a use for it. And we'll come back to that. But now it's spreading because of lots of reasons, but most especially because of climate change and the changes in land management that we have. So there's fewer frost days, it doesn't get knocked back regularly, and we've stopped using it the way it was used in the past. Most people I talk to from a farming background and some from an ecological background, you know, think bracken is public enemy #1, but there are some positive aspects to it. Okay, so if you think about it, bracken is underground for 6 months of the year. So there are other things there on the surface of the soil when that bracken is underneath, unless we have, you know, really thick litter from the bracken. So in woodland sites, bracken was often associated with plants like bluebells, anemones, sorrel, primroses. And they're all spring plants that can get the light before the bracken emerges. And then where woodland has disappeared from our environment, because we know we've a lot less woodland now than we had in the past, bracken is a kind of a substitute woodland for these plants. So it'll protect them. In the picture there, I actually crawled in under the bracken to get a photograph of what was there. And you can see there, you probably won't see the mouse moving, but foxgloves growing, dandelions, plenty of grasses, you know, so there's a lot of things can still survive underneath that bracken because it's only shading them for part of the year. When bracken occurs in woodlands and in heaths, it can provide nesting opportunities for about 15 bird species in Ireland, but obviously not for ground nesting birds. And it can provide lying up cover for animals, including sheep. Like deer often leave their calves hidden in bracken, for example. And it can also make a good nursery crop for forestry. So if you put fast growing trees in, it can protect them while they're getting established, but obviously not for the slower ones. And this is because it grows on those better soils and it can act as a soil improver. So another use of bracken that I've seen in the UK rather than in Ireland is in national parks in the UK. Sometimes they leave bracken there to prevent people getting to places they don't want them to go, because people won't really walk through a very dense stand of bracken. So it can keep people onto tracks when they need it. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is the bracken can be positive, and the issues that arise from bracken really are not so much to do about bracken being there as how dense the bracken stand actually is. So I mentioned that in the past bracken was managed and it was used. So this is a shot from Wicklow. You can see that's Loch Dan there in the distance. And on the slopes here, we have actually got a lot of lazy beds. So this was an area that would have been farmed, particularly, we'll say, in famine times and when Ireland's population was, you know, was much greater than it is today. So we find that there's an association between bracken and abandoned farmland. And I'll come back to that a little in a minute. But bracken itself was used for bedding down animals. It can be used for eating. it was used in making glass, the ash, and in making soap. So when those lands were farmed, the bracken was controlled by cattle trampling on it, but it was also cut to make winter bedding for those animals. And in Ireland, we have a right of endover, which meant that you had a right to cut bracken on that land so that you could use it for bedding. During the 1970s and the 1980s, sheep numbers actually increased across the mountains in Ireland and in Britain. And in some places that led to overgrazing, which allowed bracken take off because there was less competition there from other plants like the heathers and frockin and so on. So that's part of it, but also the abandonment of land when it wasn't actually used again allowed it to get going. And strangely, there are some modern uses for bracken. And what we find here is that it can be used as a fertilizer. It's used as a food. I had a lovely experience one time when the Japanese emperor and his wife came on a visit to Glendalough. I met them, but I was talking to one of the ladies in waiting, and she got so excited when she saw the bracken along the side of the path. And she told me that it's really good if you eat the fronds with a little bit of soy sauce, just fry them up. I told her I'd take her word at that. I wasn't going to try it out. So in Wales in particular, but in other places in the UK, they've started to try and use it for biofuel, making these brackets and using machines like the one you see in the picture there to harvest it. What we do know in terms of it as a fertilizer is that 1 ton of potash can be gained from about 50 tons of bracken. We know that we could actually export the bracken fronds as food. So we have had people picking bracken to export it to the Korean market, but I think it's just so labor intensive that it's probably not commercially viable. When they're making the brackets and as the biofuels, they have to reduce the moisture. So they dry it out and then bale it. So it needs to be reduced by about 20% to get it to that point that it can be used as a fuel. And sometimes it's used into pellet, it's made into pellets as well as the kind of brackets. So how come bracken is doing so well and has done so for so long? It's actually a really, really successful plant. And if we want to manage it, we need to understand the plant for what it is. Okay. So it's sorry that the picture there is a little bit blurred, but you can see here what part of the underground part of the plant, and then obviously the crozier as the plant starts to grow. And these rhizomes that are under the ground have buds on them. And this is why if we cut bracken, we get a lot more fronds than you had originally when you cut it. But they're usually shorter, because for every frond that you see above the ground, there's 26 buds under the ground ready to pop into action if something happens to that frond. So we look at it in a little more detail, because as they say, know your enemy. And above the ground here in this picture, you'd see 1 or 2 fronds. So there's a crozier that's developing and there's a full-grown frond, okay? And they don't look like that much, but underneath it's really, really different. So this is a special rhizome, which is the one that grows the fronds up above the ground. And then it has this massive, big, thick rhizome that this frond grows from, which stores all the food. That's called an adventitious rhizome, okay? This could be about 20 meters long on one plant. So when we think of that, 20 meters, you know, bigger than our houses put together, you know, all one plant underneath the ground. And we really need to keep that in mind when we're talking about managing bracken. it's as I've mentioned, the main food storage part of the plants. And the tips, this part here where it says active terminal buds, they grow really, really quickly. And in the right conditions, they could grow 10 meters in a year. So that's why bracken can spread so quickly. And due to all that food that's stored there in it under the ground, it has the energy to grow as it wants. So when we want to manage bracken, what we actually have to try and do is starve the plant. And I think we need to remember that. That's what managing bracken is all about. It's starving the plant. It's getting rid of this food store that's under the ground so that it can't do this massive expansion that it really wants to do. So if we had a 1 hectare stand of dense bracken, we could have 100 tons of rhizomes underneath that. And they'll stay inactive for many, many years. And then when conditions improve, they'll put up fronds again. So if you think back to it being a forest plant, you know, it could be a long time under shady oak trees. Then the oak tree falls, and those roots that have managed to live under the ground now have a chance to put up fronds because there's sunlight again for it. So it's important that we deal with the rhizomes when we're dealing with the plants. So what about controlling it then? I have written in capital letters there, do not burn. And I know that often gets me into trouble because a lot of people like burning things as a way of controlling it. But there's a special reason for not burning bracken. Bracken contains potash, okay? And when you burn it, you actually release the potash. So what you're doing is fertilizing the soil so that those rhizomes that are still safely under the ground that didn't burn now have a fertilizer and can grow faster and better and stronger. Okay. I already mentioned that we get potash from bracken if we want to use it as a fertilizer. And this, in a way, is why it's associated with lazy beds, if we think about it, because our ancestors used to burn bracken for a purpose. They wanted to get potash into those lazy beds so that they could grow better potatoes. So they were actually using it as a fertilizer in that sense. Okay. But if we burn it now, all we're doing really is giving it the juice to get going and to be stronger. So once bracken takes off like that, it's going to outcompete everything else that grows there because it has the space, the light, and the fertilizer. So that rhizome under the ground is going, woohoo, you know, we've made it. This is really what I want. I also mentioned at the start of the talk that one of the things that's causing bracken to spread now is that we have less frosty days. A really good way of controlling bracken is by freezing it. There's a reason it doesn't live in Antarctica. And I've noticed this a few times myself up here in the Wicklow Mountains when we've had some really severe winters. If the frost comes late in the year when the fronds have started to grow, it really hits it back. So there was one particular year where we had a very severe frost. I remember it. It was the 28th of May. And that same year, we got a really severe frost on the 5th of September. So the bracken croziers had come up, they were whacked in May. And then while they were still gathering food in the autumn for the winter, they got whacked again by a frost. And the following 2 or 3 years, the bracken was actually less dense than it had been before that. So that, I would say, it got about a 5-year setback that time from that serious frost. I've written pigs there beside that because one of the reasons that people sometimes use pigs in managing bracken is pigs root the ground. And that means they expose those underground rhizomes. And then if it's frosty weather, those rhizomes take a hit. So that's one of the advantages of using pigs as a mechanical way of dealing with bracken. Okay. Starving it, as I've said, is the main way of managing bracken. And we starve it by bruising it, by cutting it, or by crushing it as a way to try and do that. So we wait until the rhizome has used up some food by sending up the croziers and getting the fronds going. So it you know, before the fronds are properly opened and able to start making food, it has to depend on the rhizome. So we allow it to take off like that, and then we get in there. So that's the first kind of bashing, bruising, crushing that we use for that. And then if we wait for the second round later in the summer, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prevent food being stored again. So obviously on a slope, crushing is difficult, and we also know that the bracken sometimes holds the soil together. Machinery can damage that soil, so sometimes cutting can be done by hand or tractor mounted, as you see in some of the pictures there. Spraying then is, I suppose, maybe the method of choice in many cases. And this is important when there are accessibility issues. And I know that you all know quite a lot about Azulam at this stage, that you've been using it in the project down in Kerry. It's the recommended herbicide. You don't actually see the effects of Azulam, as you know, until the following year. And I've seen pictures from the MacGillycuddy Reeks where you've been working with it and very sensibly dressed up in lots of PPE and using a dye to show what has been sprayed and what hasn't, and that's a very sensible approach to it. What it does is the poison really from the herbicide gets brought down into the rhizome and gets stored there, and it affects the dormant buds. So those 26 buds that are underneath the ground, for every one frond you see, they get affected by the Azulox. So that's what knocks the bracken back using that. I mentioned don't burn it. So just to kind of underline it, I want to show you this picture from Wicklow. So this was immediately after a fire that we had one year. The vegetation on that spot before the fire was a mixture of bracken, grasses, heathers and gorse. But you can see there's a tiny bit of grass has survived in here in the picture, but mostly what you see is bracken. So the bracken, because those rhizomes are under the ground, they didn't get affected by the fire. It's able to send up the extra shoots, and off it takes. So in a few weeks after this photo, basically those fronds had shaded out absolutely everything else. So the chances of the other plants recovering from that fire were much lessened by the fact that the bracken was given this chance to take off. And that area is actually quite a bracken covered area now. The only positive, I suppose, aspect of it is that there isn't actually any dead layer of bracken left under that. So the kind of litter layer probably got burned in that fire, but the downside of it is the heavy shade that's going to be there. And that area would need basically treatment to prevent the regrowth of the bracken. I think one of the most important questions, and I ask this not just as an ecologist, but also for you as a farmer, a question to ask is, what do we want after bracken? You know, why are we managing it? Are we just managing it because we don't like it? Or are we trying to get to a different point, a different habitat to restore some of what would have been there if the bracken wasn't there, to get grazing areas? What is our aim in managing the bracken? And I don't think anybody controls bracken really just for the sake of controlling it. We are looking for a different vegetation cover. In the Blackstairs Mountains, when I spoke to the farmers there, they were talking about trying to get back to heath conditions. Okay, so they had a dry heath habitat in the area, which was ling and bell heather with various herbs, then lichens, upland grasses. And I think it's pretty much the same in Kerry and in Wicklow in what we're looking for. So if you the picture here is of some dry heath, and you'll actually see different kind of fern growing there. So we have our bell heather, and we have some ling heather. We've plenty of upland grasses as well in that. So there's a good mixture of what's there. And that's the kind of habitat that in some places has been overcome by bracken, and what we're trying to restore. So how do we do that? Like, we have to remember that if bracken is there, it probably means that this area was once forested. Okay, and we need to give plants a chance to grow. So in the UK, what they did in the beginning, when people started talking about managing bracken, was they gave these agri-environmental grants for a once-off spraying, and they discovered that 5 years later it was back to exactly what it had been when they did the one-off spraying. Okay. So now what they recommend in the UK is doing smaller areas and then doing spot spraying for a number of years afterwards. And that's just to control the bracken. And I think that's pretty much in line what you're doing down in Kerry from my chats with Tricia. I think the key really is it is the depth of the dead bracken underneath the top layer. So how thick is that litter layer? So if that's very dense, so we'll say it's like 15, 20 centimeters deep, the other plants can't really grow or recover. We need to get rid of that dense layer first. But do you remember the picture I showed at the beginning where I'd crawled in on? There were lots of plants of different species in underneath that. So if like 30 to 40% of the ground underneath your bracken already has other plants like that in it, that'll recover itself once you treat the bracken, and then just keep an eye on grazing, that you don't overgraze it, that you give the other plants a chance to get going. Okay. So if we look then at the types of follow-up treatment, so sometimes it's about trying to get rid of that layer of dead bracken. I know that this picture is from the Blackstairs Mountains, and in parts of the Blackstairs they have mat grass is quite frequent, and as any farmer knows, mat grass is not very nutritious, and it's the one that the sheep will leave till the absolute last. They won't eat it. So obviously you don't want something like that to take over after your bracken, so you have to kind of keep a little eye on what's doing, and perhaps there might be some spraying for a grass like mat grass. So if there is this big dense layer of dead litter underneath it, that might need to be raked up or disturbed so that the seed bank that's underneath that gets a chance to get going again. Okay. If you've really big wide expanses of bracken, maybe sources of grass and heather seed might be too far away, so they mightn't actually be able to spread back in naturally, and it might need to be reseeded. So when I have brashing there on that, what I mean is that heather with seeds is cut in another area, and that's brought back in and placed on the area you want it to grow, and let it take off there from that. So, but again, if you're doing that, that has to be spread to a depth of about 8 to 10 centimeters, so that there'll be enough new seedlings for that to get going, and that they'll be protected from being grazed as they get growing. But that's only going to work, obviously, if you've raked up the stuff and have got some nice bare areas, and you can put some suitable grass seed mixes in with that. But the important thing, I suppose, again, is to remember that it's not just about getting rid of the bracken, but it's about following up and choosing what you want to be there in the long term. And obviously tree planting would work quite well there in a situation like that if you want to go with trees. So we talked a little bit about the azulam that's used for treating bracken. And I just want to talk a bit about water now. We know that bracken close to water, if water is used as a drinking source of water, the bracken spores in that water are toxic to humans and animals and can cause cancers. So if we're trying to spray, we need to keep back from water courses. And in Wicklow, at one stage in the Glen of Amal, there was a plan to do some aerial spraying. but it ran aground really because of the difficulty of trying to ensure that the spray itself didn't get into water. So we've a kind of a double-edged problem there. We have the spores from the bracken in the water, but also we don't want to get the azilam in the water. There was a health scare with azilam when it was discovered in spinach that had been watered. I think it was in Spain, or it might have been Portugal. And this is part of the reason for that limited derogation that we have in Ireland on the use of it. And also further studies have shown kind of that it affects your hormones in your body. With birds, it leads to egg thinning. They did tests on goats and chickens, and they found it in the eggs and the milk. So it's toxic to birds. It's really, really deadly for any kind of aquatic species. It's poisonous for honeybees. It's poisonous for earthworms. And in humans, it causes skin problems, eye problems, respiratory problems. And it's really, really water soluble. So that's the whole issue with using it in places that have a lot of water. And I suppose that causes problems for us in the mountains in Ireland, if you think about it, because although this looks like there's one stream in that photograph, basically every dip in that landscape has water running down it somewhere. So, you know, we need to kind of keep that in mind when we're using it. So at the start, Trish mentioned as well that the whole of your project area is part of a special area of conservation. And the control of bracken within SACs is actually quite an important part of reaching the aim of that SAC. So why is the SAC set up? It's set up for particular habitats. Generally speaking, in the mountains in Ireland, it's set up for bog and for heath, be it wet heath or dry heath. And we're trying to conserve those habitats. And we're also trying, in some cases, to restore those habitats from areas where they have been damaged. So the management of bracken is an important part of doing that. But we have to be a little bit careful if we're using the azilam, because it can kill some of the grasses that ain't in the mountain. So bent grasses and fescue grasses, there are upland grasses. Yorkshire fog is very susceptible to it, but that's mostly going to be in fields rather than, I suppose, up on the mountains. And it can also affect birch trees, larch trees and willows as well. And to some extent, the spruces, the Norway spruce and the Sitka spruce. So all of that information is from the makers of the chemical. So they know that these are issues. And we have to remember that it's specifically targeted at ferns. So every other kind of fern that grows on that landscape is going to be killed by it as well. So not just the bracken. This means that if we're using it in special areas of conservation, we need to get special permissions. So I'm sure as farmers you have come across the word ARC before. So it's an activity requiring consent. So Bracken Control must get the consent of a government department if it's going to be in one of those designated sites in a special area of conservation or a special protection area for birds. So it's an activity requiring consent. Asking for that consent is literally just that. It doesn't mean that it's a banned activity. It means it's an activity that just needs consent because it needs to be thought through. And all those benefits of restoring a habitat versus the side effects that azilam can have in a habitat, or for the humans using it, have to be weighed up. And it's to make sure that it's used properly in those ways. Okay, so the decision making part of that, then once it has been applied for, we'll look at areas like, what's the size of the area that's going to be treated? What are the chances of the heather or the upland grasslands recovering if the bracken's removed? How far might the spray drift from the area that you're using it? Is there a chance of it getting into water, and so on? So sometimes when you apply for an ARC, the department might come back to you and ask you for further information, but it's literally so that all those kind of things are thought of in making that decision. It could be our department, as in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, that's the consent authority, but it may also be the Department of Agriculture. So for the EIPs, the Department of Agriculture is the consent authority for the activities requiring consent. But in other cases, it'll be the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But you don't have to worry too much about it, in a sense. If you send it to the wrong department, you will be quickly told it's not for us, not our work this time. Or it'll, and it'll be moved on to the correct department to deal with. So I think I think just to kind of finish up this particular talk, what I want to do really is to thank you, not just for listening to me rabbiting on here about managing Bracken, but also for the work that you're doing in managing the uplands well, and in thinking about these issues, and in tackling things that, because of the changes in our life and our lifestyles, have become an issue that for our ancestors weren't, because Bracken was useful to them. They managed it. It's a problem for us, but you're tackling that head on. And I think what you're doing in Kerry is going to feed into how all the different mountains in Ireland are managed into the future. So I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and I want to thank you, and thank you for letting me talk to you today.
Enda, thank you so much. I was trying to come up with questions as you were talking, but every time I came up with a question, you'd answer it in the next breath. You saved me a lot of time and effort there. But yeah, it is really important, I suppose, to all the aspects you hit on, like the training. There is mandatory training that you should have carried out before you use any pesticide. And I know we're looking at a range of different treatments in Wicklow as well as here in Kerry.
Yeah.
The trampling with the cattle is a one that we're really interested in. And I suppose it's probably one of the really shortfalls, I suppose, of the agri-environmental projects, that they are so short.
Yeah.
You need to look at the long-term management, and that's what every farmer, whether they're in our project or outside of our project. So if people are watching this webinar and they're anywhere else in the country, you do have to really consider the long-term impact of what you're going to do, how you're going to manage it, and the aftercare. Because, realistically, I suppose the permission for Aslux is not going to be there for much longer. There are so to be cognizant of that.
And I think I didn't really say much about cattle there in it, in terms of trampling it. But we did do a short experiment here in Wicklow at one stage with cattle and with horses. Now, I'm not talking about within the Suez project, because that's now taking off, experimenting with that. But years ago, the National Park brought some Connemara ponies up from Connemara, obviously, and brought some Kerry cattle up from Kerry, and we put them out on the Bracken. Now, the cattle just kept walking home. They just wanted to come back to their nice feed, and they didn't want to be out there at all. And we did have a slight health issue with one of the horses, where a foal actually ate some bracken and got sick from that. But I think the use of animals is in that after management stage, generally speaking, where you're just trying to keep it trampled down. You've already whacked it, and then you want to just keep on top of it. So I think the more we experiment with things like that, the better we'll be able to manage into the future.
Yeah, it is. It's all about the experiments, because we tried the Drummane cattle here, the Drummond cattle. The different pronunciation of them, but we were looking really at the native breeds, because we thought they'd be a little bit more suited. And I suppose we looked at the altitude as well, that we're looking at the farms here in the MacGillycuddy Reeks, and we're very jealous when we look at some of your photographs, Enda, because there's no rocks in a lot of them. And if only it was that easy down here.
No, I think the rocks are just very well hidden in those photos.
maybe so. Yeah. But it kind of, like, you do need a bit of advice, and that's what we're here for, is just try to help. We won't have all the answers, but I think a lot of it is actually just trialing in different initiatives and just seeing what does work. It might be cutting, it might be hard work. I know we said one guy earlier this month to cut back by using streamers, because it's near a water course, and we're very conscious of the damage, and maintaining good buffer zones if you're using spray, because it has such a negative impact, and it's aware of the environmental consequences.
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of water being extracted from the mountains as well for everybody to drink, not just stock, but also for humans.
Yeah.
So I suppose it maintains those buffer zones, but cutting it, so we're cutting it twice a year.
Yeah.
And maybe at the end of the season in hopes that it knocks it back. But when we look at starving the plant, I suppose it's the lifespan of the bracken. It really is a robust little piece.
Yeah. Oh yeah, such a tough plant, you know. And I should have mentioned there, like sometimes people get themselves all tied up in knots about the bird nesting season as well, because there are obviously limitations in the Wildlife Act in terms of dealing with vegetation between the 1st of March and the end of August. But there is a special provision made for dealing with plants that are invasive, or so there is a license that can be obtained for dealing with bracken. So that means that when you need to do that kind of second rolling and all the rest in the summer, a license can be gained, and there's no problem getting one of them.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's about observing your site as well and making plenty of noise when you're on site. So if there is any nesting happen to be there, you know, you can make sure that there, you know, you can negate that as well. There's steps you can take, but I'd also say that make plenty of noise. But I mean, for things like the strimmer as well, you know, you can make plenty of noise beforehand. You can go out.
Exactly. Well, the strimmer is so noisy.
Which was really interesting, and I think people will have found out a lot of things. I think, definitely knowing that it's edible, that would have been the news. Carcinogenic, because I suppose the fear with a lot of our farmers as well is that, you know, there would have been years ago, I suppose, if there wasn't a lot of other plants available on the land, that the animals probably would have gone for the bracken, seen it. I suppose the younger animals especially would have seen it, probably something they could eat, and they would have got sick and some could have died. So that's probably still a historical fear that's here, you know, but we can go ground and say, if there's a lot of other plants, then you can maybe bring in other animals to knock it back, and if they've other to graze on. But we've noticed from our trials is that really the livestock don't like going into dense bracken. They might go into the lighter stuff, but the dense stuff, they won't make it. Even if you try and encourage them in with mineral licks and, you know, things like that, they're kind of going, why would we go in there? Even if you try to force them into it, it's not.
Yeah. And like, if you think of it, we don't like going in there ourselves either. Like, I often wish I had a machete if I'm going out for a walk, you know, close to where I live, that I could just cut my path through it, rather than trying to burst my way through those big fronds that are shoulder height in places, you know.
But it's about, I suppose, knowing as well that it's getting permission and it's talking to people, and, you know, the buffer zone, being aware of those things, like I mentioned, is critically important, because not just for the effect on the environment, but for your own health as well. Actually going out, you're using any kind of spray or pesticide at all. I see people all the time spraying and they're not wearing any of the basic things, even and it's just, it's not worth it, because it's years you'll be sorry. But I think that's the important point, Enda, from what you said. It is the aftercare then, once you've done anything, it's to keep on top of it. Going to disappear overnight. Because it does have a nice long lifespan. And what did you say there, 20 meters, you could have that I can't pronounce that now, but
the rhizome, is 20 meters underground. And I think that thing of, what was it, 100 tons, isn't it, of rhizomes in a hectare, you know, in a dense stand.
That is just lads, I hope you don't take that too seriously. It doesn't turn you off everything we're going to ask you now to do for the next 2 months here in Kerry.
No, but I think the message of hope, which maybe I didn't, you know, explain enough, is 5 years is what's going to make a huge difference in that. So if you keep on top of it for 5 years, you really have controlled it. And as you said, like, a lot of the EIPs, they're too short. It gives us a chance to start things, but it doesn't really give us a chance to follow up on things. And it's all very understandable, because 5 years is a medium-term plan in the life of any government, you know. But at the same time, ecology is about hundreds of years, you know. And if you think of it, I said we began to kind of abandon land back in the 1970s, really, you know, the 60s and 70s in Ireland. Well, like, that's 50 years, you know, when we think of it. So, you know, it's a different time scale that we work on when we're working with vegetation and with plants, you know.
Absolutely. It takes longer, and like you said, I mean, our fear here is probably that we could be looking at land abandonment again, you know. It's hard to make a living, you know, and I suppose it goes down to, I mean, these areas are tremendously hard. They're labor intensive areas to work. you know, like I said, just managing sheep alone, not mind trying to introduce cattle again.
Yeah.
Trying to strike the balance, and it's all about balance, because I suppose we know that people have to make a living as well as having to improve all of these areas, because they are all they're all conservation areas, they're all special area conservation. They are protected under law. We do need to get them into better status than they are. They are in bad condition. But I suppose we know that it can work, and we know that farmers are to undertake all of these different initiatives for us, but they need to be paid and they need to be rewarded for their effort as well. You know,
absolutely.
Again, it's trying to strike the balance between, I suppose, production versus environment. And, you know, you probably on the ground to help the landscape management, you know, so looking at it a bit differently. But soap, I must investigate the soap making, because my mother was her day, so she was, so this would be interesting to look into this. It's very, I suppose they just used everything too long ago. They kind of didn't waste anything. I suppose there wasn't
that's it.
They weren't buying the fertilizers or the rations like we are now, or even fencing posts. It was a case of build up those hedgerows and things, and they probably used probably more aware of wastage and what can we use and what can be beneficial. So
exactly.
I'm thinking if Asylum and Aslox isn't going to be permitted going forward, we might be looking at liquid nitrogen and freezing of Bracken around the country. I was concocting what now could be used. So I'm sure I get in trouble for that comment now, but I'm curious for anybody that's watching. Can I ask you one question? What is Bracken? You mentioned Fracken, and I've never come across Fracken.
Okay, it might be just different names for plants. So Fracken bilberries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I know.
I at one stage I did some studying in the UK, and I always knew that plant as Fracken. And I could not figure out what in the name of God bilberries were that they kept talking about. And every time I said Fracken, they thought I said Bracken.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So we had slight cultural issues there trying to figure one another out. But bilberry,
Okay. Yeah, it happens everywhere. The cultural difference don't have to be in different countries. So our ecologist Mary is from Dublin, and Mary would have always called ferns Bracken, but here we'd call them ferns.
Ferns,
Yeah, gorse and furze as well. It's like, what's the difference? Well, there's no difference at all. So to translate. So if anybody's watching this from anywhere else, that's what we're talking about, guys. So Enda, thank you so much. This was you've been a wealth of information, and I think definitely we have a lot to take in there, from the very basics of why it's there, first of all. What you want after is the next question. Think of any treatment method. When you do your treatment, the aftercare, the long-term maintenance then of that, and to keep on top of it, because otherwise it'll be fine. Well, thank you so much. So with that,
you're very well.
Recording, and if anybody's any queries, please do come back and talk to us, because we're here to help and share as much information as we can. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.